America, and you are the greatest people on earth. We won in a landslide, and we're going to continue to do it. And I just want to thank everybody. You got out there, and they voted, and they pressed doorbells. And I just want to thank you all, and I hope my son's doing a good job representing me. Otherwise, I'll have to say, you're fired, Don. You're fired. So thank you very much, and have a great day. And I hope Don makes a great speech. If he doesn't make a great speech, let me know about it. I'll give him hell.
Well, Dad, there's literally...
Everybody, Don, go have a good time. And say hello to Erica. Go have a good time, everybody.
Well, there's 30,000 young patriots in this room. The movement continues.
You just watched something so fundamentally revealing about where we are in this moment of catastrophic political transformation that I need you to understand the gravity of what you've just witnessed, the weight of what we are confronting as a nation, teetering on the precipice of something unimaginable and yet all too familiar to those who have studied the arc of history bending toward autocracy. Trump claimed he won in a landslide, when the actual data tells a profoundly different story. His national popular vote lead was 1.6 points, and any argument that the 2024 election was a landslide is misleading. But here's what should send chills down your spine and what progressives absolutely must comprehend in this perilous hour. This was Trump's first rally-style speech since the election, and he chose to deliver it at America Fest, which showcased the successful campaign that re-elected Donald Trump and the formidable support for his upcoming administration. And what you heard in that clip was his son Don bragging about 30,000 attendees, 54% of them women, which tells us something profoundly disturbing about the metastasizing nature of this movement, because this isn't your grandfather's Republican Party gathering anymore, and this is where the philosophical scaffolding of American fascism is being constructed in real time. The myth-making begins immediately with the landslide narrative, this grandiose rewriting of democratic reality that represents the epistemic violence at the heart of authoritarian movements throughout history, and here's what the actual numbers reveal about Trump's so-called mandate. Trump won 312 electoral votes, a solid win, but in the lower half of U.S. presidential elections, nowhere near Reagan's 525 electoral votes in 1984, and more than 58% of the popular vote or Nixon and Johnson, who both exceeded 60% in the popular vote. And yet Trump stands before these young activists proclaiming historic triumph because the truth has become completely negotiable in the MAGA universe, subordinated to the construction of mythic narrative that fuels the movement's revolutionary energy. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned us about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism, when she explained that totalitarian movements don't just lie about facts, they create entire alternate realities where empirical truth becomes irrelevant compared to the emotional cohesion of the movement, and that's precisely what we're witnessing here, as Trump transforms a narrow victory into legendary conquest before an audience primed to accept and amplify this manufactured reality. But wait, because here's where it gets exponentially more terrifying, and here's what should galvanize every single person who cares about the future of pluralistic democracy in America. Trump gained 23 points with voters under the age of 25. Trump's campaign succeeded where many Republican predecessors had failed in attracting 18 to 29-year-old voters, which means we are watching the successful radicalization of an entire generation through the infrastructure that Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA have meticulously constructed over more than a decade. In 2024, Turning Point USA grossed nearly $85 million in revenue and had chapters on over 3,300 college and high school campuses, creating what amounts to a nationwide apparatus for youth indoctrination into authoritarian politics disguised as campus activism, and the sheer scale of this operation should alarm anyone who understands how fascist movements historically captured the imagination and loyalty of young people by offering them belonging, purpose, and a mythology of national rebirth. What you heard in that clip was Trump doing what authoritarians always do, what Mussolini did in the piazzas of Italy, and what every strongman throughout history has perfected, the creation of parasocial intimacy with the masses through performance of folksy authenticity, joking with his son about firing him, thanking the greatest people on earth, constructing an emotional bond that transcends policy and enters the realm of faith. The crowd isn't evaluating his governance record or his policy proposals. They're experiencing something far more primal and far more dangerous. They're participating in what the French sociologist Émile Durkheim called collective effervescence, that ecstatic feeling of belonging to something larger than oneself, that religions and fascist movements both harness to create unshakable devotion. "Thank you, God, for sending us Donald Trump," said Turning Point founder Charlie Kirk, as Trump took the stage, which is the language of messianic politics, the fusion of nationalism and religious fervor that creates the conditions for democratic backsliding, because when your leader is divinely appointed, criticism becomes heresy, and opposition becomes apostasy. And let's excavate what's happening with this youth movement, because Trump's 2024 election victory saw his support among 18 to 29-year-old voters jump 11% from 2020, as he won 47% of the demographic that came in large part due to outreach to young white men. Trump carried 63% of that vote, while his next two highest demographics were Latino men and white women at 49% each. This represents a seismic shift in American political consciousness, a rightward lurch among young people that defies the conventional wisdom that younger generations inevitably lean progressive, and it's happening because the material conditions of late capitalism have created profound alienation and economic anxiety that the right has successfully channeled into reactionary politics, while the Democratic establishment continues to offer means-tested incrementalism. Nowhere in the world are young men as lonely in comparison to other people in their country as they are in the U.S. 1 in 4 U.S. men ages 15 to 34 said they felt lonely, and into this void of meaning and connection steps Turning Point USA, with its promise of belonging, its mythology of embattled patriots fighting against a corrupt establishment, its construction of young conservatives as countercultural rebels. The 20,000 young people in that room cheering for Trump represent what the political scientist Robert Paxton identified as the essential element of fascism, mass mobilization of the discontented middle class, through the creation of a mythic national community under assault from internal enemies. Speakers and attendees at AmericaFest 2024 hailed Trump and billionaire Elon Musk for initially scuttling a bipartisan agreement to keep government open. They jeered House Speaker Mike Johnson and his willingness to engage with Democrats, which reveals the underlying contempt for democratic process and compromise that animates this movement, because bipartisanship is weakness, negotiation is betrayal, and only total victory against the enemy within satisfies the appetite for political warfare. This is the politics of friend and enemy that Carl Schmitt theorized as the essence of the political, the reduction of democratic pluralism to existential struggle, where your opponents aren't fellow citizens with different views, but enemies to be vanquished. Now here's the bombshell that should electrify our understanding of what's coming, and I need you to grasp this with absolute clarity. Trump's musing about turning the military on radical left lunatics led a Harvard expert on democracy to pronounce it classic authoritarian discourse. Trump also doubled down post-election on his support for the military mass deporting 11 million undocumented immigrants, which means we are watching in real time the articulation of a governing agenda rooted in the deployment of state violence against political opponents and vulnerable populations. In Trump's second term, the Department of Justice is now to be transformed into a political enforcement body for the president. The public prosecutors are to be used to prosecute political opponents. This applies not only to prominent Democrats but also to social protest movements, climate activists, and other advocates of liberal values. And this isn't speculation anymore. These are stated intentions backed by detailed plans in Project 2025 that lay out the architecture of authoritarian governance. The scholars of authoritarianism have been sounding the alarm, and their warnings grow more urgent with each passing day. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, an expert in Italian fascism, says Trump has already done things that autocrats do. He instigated a violent coup attempt, and instead of exile or prison, managed to paint it as a positive thing, or make a lot of Americans shrug their shoulders at it. These are preconditions for autocracy. Ben-Ghiat warns that what Trump has in store will be far more violent than Orban's model, because Orban didn't stage a violent attack, sending lawmakers running for their lives, and we've already seen the capacity for political violence that January 6th represented. We've already witnessed the willingness of this movement to employ force when democratic means fail to deliver their desired outcome. The question isn't whether they'll attempt authoritarian governance. The question is whether our institutions and our mobilized resistance can stop them. What makes this moment uniquely perilous is that with Republicans controlling both houses, Congress is unlikely to provide a check on Trump's power. Other institutions are also likely to be less effective at stopping him this time around. In the previous administration, his own cabinet members often challenged Trump's most destructive directives, but this time he is choosing loyalists who will never provide resistance. With a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, the judiciary is also unlikely to provide a substantial check on his power. The guardrails have been systematically dismantled, the institutions that constrained his first term have been captured or neutralized, and the Republican Party has completed its transformation into a personality cult, unified only by devotion to Trump and contempt for their enemies. That dynamic fuels the unpredictability put on display in the budget fight and sets up inevitable future conflicts within Trump's broadened Republican coalition. But those internal tensions won't save us because authoritarians thrive in chaos, using crisis and instability to justify ever greater concentrations of power. And here's what progressives must understand about the nature of the threat we face, and I cannot emphasize this enough, because so much of the liberal response has been inadequate to the magnitude of this crisis. By deflecting legitimate economic grievances towards external bogeymen and migrants, it is the authoritarian right, not the progressive left, that has most successfully capitalized on this broken system. We are living through the consequences of 40 years of neoliberal governance that has produced skyrocketing inequality, wage stagnation, the destruction of labor power, the financialization of everything, and the atomization of communities. And into this landscape of despair and rage, the right has offered scapegoats and myths, while liberals have offered fact checks and technocratic solutions. The democratic establishment's failure to articulate a coherent response to the economic anxiety and social dislocation that capitalism produces has created the conditions for fascism to flourish, and simply calling Trump a threat to democracy, while True has proven insufficient to mobilize the multiracial working-class coalition necessary to defeat him. What you witnessed in that clip was theatrical fascism, the aestheticization of politics that Walter Benjamin identified as fascism's fundamental characteristic, the transformation of governance into spectacle where the crowd becomes protagonist in a narrative of national redemption. Those 30,000 young people aren't there for policy briefings, they're there for the experience of collective power, for the thrill of belonging to something historic, for the pleasure of having their rage validated and their enemies named. It is highly likely that future trigger events will arise as Trump begins implementing his agenda. Although he won a commanding electoral victory, a significant portion of his gains can be attributed to rejection of the status quo, and a desire on the part of voters to sweep out a broken political establishment, which means his support is contingent and contestable, built on sand rather than bedrock, vulnerable to erosion when the promises of national rebirth collide with the reality of authoritarian governance. This is where the resistance must focus its energy, and this is where I need you to understand the strategic imperative facing the left in this moment of maximum danger. A mass call 2 days after the election, organized by a coalition of 200 groups, drew well in excess of 100,000 people, with thousands signing up for follow-up community gatherings, which demonstrates that the infrastructure for resistance exists, and the appetite for mobilization remains strong. We can draw on lessons from what has worked in the past, and what we know can be effective in confronting autocrats. Our job will be to take advantage of the moments of opportunity that arise in coming months, to hold the line against Trump's authoritarianism, and also link them to a vision for creating the transformative change we need. This cannot be a purely defensive struggle to preserve the status quo ante. It must be an affirmative project that offers material improvements in people's lives, that builds working-class power, that creates alternative institutions and forms of solidarity that can withstand authoritarian assault. The young people in that room cheering for Trump aren't irredeemable fascists. Many of them are searching for meaning and community and purpose in a world that has offered them precarity and alienation. And they've found it in the MAGA movement, because the left has failed to provide a compelling alternative vision. Young men are drawn to Trump because he offers them a mythology of masculine strength and a scapegoat for their grievances, and unless progressives can articulate a politics that addresses their material needs while challenging, rather than reinforcing patriarchal violence, we will continue to lose this generation. The answer isn't to water down our commitments to racial justice, gender equality, and climate action. The answer is to show how those struggles are interconnected with the class struggle, how the fight for Palestinian liberation is connected to the fight against police violence, is connected to the fight for universal health care, is connected to the fight against fossil fuel capitalism. What Trump revealed in that clip through his casual performative dominance, threatening to fire his own son as a joke while the crowd laughs, is the aesthetics of authoritarian masculinity that appeals to young men who have been taught that strength means domination and compromise means weakness. He scapegoated groups that he accused of corrupting culture, limiting freedoms, and taking economic advantage of normal Americans, trans youth, immigrants, Muslims, progressive activists, civil servants, which is the classic fascist tactic of constructing the nation as a pure body under assault from polluting elements that must be expelled or eliminated. This is genocidal logic dressed in populist rhetoric, the reduction of complex social problems to the presence of internal enemies whose removal will restore national greatness. And here's the ultimate horror that we must confront with eyes wide open and with absolute determination to resist. The key strategy of today's authoritarians is not to eliminate elections, but to rig them so that the governing party always wins. Viktor Orban has been deploying this technique in Hungary to great effect. Several of Trump's key advisors have been ardent in their desire to replicate that model in America. This means the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential election will be battlegrounds not just for political power, but for the basic integrity of democratic process. And if we lose those fights, if we allow them to entrench mechanisms of permanent minority rule, then the window for democratic resistance closes, and we enter the long dark night of authoritarian governance that could last decades. So when you hear Trump claiming landslide victory before a crowd of 30,000 young activists who have been systematically radicalized through a billion-dollar infrastructure of campus organizing and media saturation, when you hear his son boasting about the movement's strength and reach, when you witness the fusion of nationalist mythology and religious fervor that characterizes contemporary American fascism, understand that you are watching the consolidation of an authoritarian movement that will not be defeated through conventional political means alone. This requires mass mobilization, strategic resistance, the building of alternative institutions, international solidarity, and above all the articulation of a genuinely transformative vision that can compete with fascism's apocalyptic myth-making. The future of democracy in America and the fate of vulnerable communities targeted by this movement depend on our capacity to rise to this historical moment with courage, clarity, and unwavering commitment to justice. This is the fight of our lives, and everything depends on how we respond to the catastrophe unfolding before us.